US President-elect Donald Trump's special envoy to Ukraine is expected to visit Kyiv this week on a fact-finding mission. Mr. Trump has promised to end that war quickly, and his envoy has published a plan to do so. Under the proposals, Kyiv would have to give up territory and abandon any immediate hope of joining NATO.
Nearly 3 years of fighting, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, infrastructure in ruins, while Russia slowly but steadily gains ground. Ukrainians are eager to see the war end. But on what terms? This man, retired General Keith Kellogg, the designated US Special Envoy for Ukraine, has a plan. Called America First, Russia and Ukraine, Kellogg proposes that the US suspend future military aid for Ukraine unless it sits down at the bargaining table with Russia. Kellogg's plan calls for putting off NATO membership for Ukraine for an extended period in exchange for security guarantees from the US and other powers for Ukraine. Russia would keep control over Ukrainian territory it now occupies. Ukraine would not have to recognise Russian sovereignty in those areas, but would not try to use force to take the land back. Russia would get relief from sanctions after it signs a comprehensive treaty. Kellogg has also said Washington should increase support for Kyiv if Russia refuses to negotiate. Until recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky consistently said that Ukraine must get back all the territory it's lost. But now he says he'd be willing to use a diplomatic process, rather than more fighting to do that. We asked people on the streets of Kyiv how they would feel about giving up territory in exchange for ending the war.
I think every citizen would be against losing territory. Why? Because the loss of territory would only delay the war, and it would continue later. Unfortunately, Russia understands only brute force and resistance.
I wouldn't want to lose any territory because I feel so sorry for the guys who are currently fighting and those who have died for these territories.
And how do they feel about taking NATO membership off the table in order to end the war?
It would be great if Ukraine were accepted into NATO, but I believe that even without NATO, countries should support us. Within NATO too, not everyone helps us, and some nations put obstacles in our way.
I'm not sure that NATO alone, as recent events unfortunately show, can provide what we might call preemptive protection or guarantee that no one will attack us. If Ukraine isn't accepted into NATO, that means we need to arm ourselves even more, and we need to change our domestic policies.
But without Russia, nothing will happen, meaning Ukraine's government faces difficult choices, as it's far from clear if Moscow is ready to negotiate.
So what might we expect from talks between Russia and Ukraine mediated by the US? Our correspondent, Sonia Phalnikar, is standing by in the Ukrainian capital, and Sergei Satanovskii joins us from our bureau in Riga, as Russia is banned from as DW is banned from reporting inside Russian territory. Welcome both. Let's start with you, Sonia Phalnikar in Kyiv. The arrival of Donald Trump's special envoy to Ukraine would usher in a new reality for the country. What are President Zelensky's red lines?
Well, we don't know yet what the Trump administration's definitive plan for Ukraine will be, but we're already seeing here a diplomatic push, a real willingness by President Zelensky to engage with Trump. He's tried to position himself as somebody who Trump can do business with. You know, he's tried to portray Ukraine as being very open to negotiations in contrast to, Russian President Putin, who he says is very, who is still issuing nuclear threats, has maximalist demands. And in recent interviews, Zelensky has said that peace talks could involve concessions, which could include ceding Russian-occupied land in the east and regaining it later through diplomacy. This is the clearest admission yet that the war could end without a swift return of occupied land. This is, of course, a very sensitive issue in Ukraine, as we saw in that report. One sticking point, of course, remains remains NATO membership for Ukraine. Most American plans seem to indicate that is off the table. But I think for Ukraine, one crucial point is that any kind of ceasefire with Russia without a mechanism in place to stop Moscow from attacking it again in future is really dangerous.
And Sergei Satanovskie in Riga, but what's the Russian perspective? Is Putin, in fact, ready to negotiate?
Well, at least he claims he's ready. At his press conference 2 weeks ago, Putin said that Moscow was ready to seek compromises, but not at the expense of its own interests. Later, Putin's foreign minister clarified what Russia considers to be such an expense. He made it clear that Russia wouldn't be satisfied with just freezing the conflict instead of reaching a proper peace agreement. One of this sticking point for Russia could be Ukraine's potential NATO membership. So Lavrov said Russia can't accept that the membership would be postponed, as what the leaks from Trump advisors suggest. Putin started this war trying to block Ukraine from joining NATO, so for him it seems to be crucial that all the sides formally agree that Ukraine never enters the alliance. What Russia also finds unacceptable is that British and EU peacekeepers would be stationed in a demilitarized zone. That is what Keith Kellogg has reportedly planned for Ukraine. Basically, for Moscow, it would mean that NATO soldiers and probably long-range missiles would be located right at the Russian border. Now, what we didn't hear from Mr. Lavrov this time is that Russia wants back the Ukrainian Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. These are the ones that Russia had occupied, then declared Russian territory, but then lost to Ukraine again. Last summer, Putin mentioned this as a prerequisite for any peace talks with Ukraine. So maybe it indicates that the Kremlin is open for a compromise on this issue.
Sonia, the Ukrainian people have displayed enormous resilience so far against Russia's invasion, and we heard some of their voices in that report. What does President Trump's return to the White House mean for them?
Well, there is certainly some anxiety here that Trump's return to the White House could, pressure Ukraine into some kind of a bad deal, leave chunks of its territory to Russia without robust security guarantees, given, Trump's previous criticism of U.S. military aid to Ukraine, his admiration for Putin, his promises to end the war swiftly. But at the same time, surprisingly, Donald Trump remains quite popular in Ukraine. If you look at the opinion polls, there are many top officials who have welcomed his re-election. That might seem surprising, but I think it has to do more with the disappointment that many Ukrainians feel with the Biden administration's, kind of cautious approach to helping the Ukrainian military. It's kind of drip feed of support, its slow pace of weapons deliveries in previous years, its lifting of restrictions for weapons system to be used in targets in Russia. And so I think many feel that, this has been enough for Ukraine to kind of stay in the fight, but has not really been enough to win the battle. So in many ways, I think there is high hope here that President Trump might just be the person to end this war, to lean on both sides in the conflict, and end this war on somewhat acceptable terms to Ukraine.
A final word to you, Sergei. Russian forces have been advancing on the battlefield, so even if a peace deal is struck, what is to stop them coming back again, as many Ukrainians fear? Briefly, if you wouldn't mind.
So, well, I guess it depends on what kind of security guarantees Ukraine will receive. And I guess there must be a clear understanding on the Russian side that Ukraine is under the West protection. And if any aggression against Ukraine, further aggression against Ukraine, would result in direct conflict with NATO countries.
Thank you so much for that. Sergei Satanovskie in Riga, Sonia Phalnikar in Kyiv. Thank you both.
Well, I'm joined now by Angela Stent. She's a former U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia. She's now advising the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. Professor, it's good to have you back on the program. First, I'd like to get your thoughts on this Kellogg plan that we just spelled out. I mean, do you think it would be acceptable to Ukraine?
It's just a starting point. I think that President Zelensky has made it clear that this will be the beginning of a diplomatic process. The Ukrainians are not going to renounce forever the territory that Russia is occupying, although they're willing to make a compromise and say that for the time being, Russia can continue to occupy it, but they want that territory back in the end. And they certainly would like to join NATO sooner rather than later, since they know that NATO membership would be the only guarantee that Russia wouldn't start the war again when it's recouped its military strength in a few years. But I think they're willing to, they'll meet with General Kellogg this week, and they're willing to take this as a starting point.
Do you see with the starting point the possibility of Ukraine being able to spin this to make it look like a victory for Kyiv?
I think if the security guarantees that General Kellogg has written about convince people that, in fact, it will deter Russia from invading again, they might be acceptable. But I think that for Ukraine, the leadership will have to say that the NATO membership is there in the future, and that's what NATO itself has said, and that the U.S. and other European countries, NATO countries, will come to their aid if Russia were to attack them again.
If you could put us at the negotiating table, what would you say would be the red lines for Ukraine when it comes to negotiations?
Well, one red line is renouncing NATO membership forever. They're not going to accept that. And also renouncing the loss of territory forever. I think those two things are definitely red lines for them. And that will clearly be a challenge if Russia is willing to sit down and negotiate.
Have those red lines, have they shifted, in your opinion, since Donald Trump won re-election?
I think they have because he has made clear that he wants to end this war. But I think they've also shifted because the Ukrainians have increasingly realized that they're very challenged on the battlefield at the moment. And it's unclear how long it would take them to take back all the territory that Russia occupies. But it's clearly not on the cards for a long time. So I think it's both what's happened on the battlefield, but also the understanding that they are going to be pressured by the Trump administration to negotiate with Russia, again, if Russia's willing to negotiate.
You have written several books on Russia, including Putin's World in the U.S.-Russian relations. What are Vladimir Putin's red lines, or is everything for him a red line?
Well, I mean, his red lines at the moment, as articulated by him and officials close to him, is a permanent neutrality for Ukraine, permanent renunciation of all the territory that Russia currently occupies, including Crimea, demilitarization of Ukraine, or at least the parts of Ukraine that border Russia. So those are some of the red lines. And the Russians have already said that the Kellogg plan, as it's been presented and as you just presented it in this report, is unacceptable for them. So it's really not clear whether Putin is going to be willing to sit down to negotiate at all. And I would also add that from the Russian point of view, Putin isn't going to negotiate with Zelensky. He's already said that he doesn't regard Zelensky as a legitimate leader of Ukraine. The Russians want to just negotiate with the United States without Ukraine and without the Europeans.
Okay. Angela Stent with the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Professor Stent, as always, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm joined now by Rachel Rizzo. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and she joins me from Washington, D.C. Rachel, good to see you. Happy New Year to you. Let's talk about Vladimir Putin for a moment. He has said multiple times that Russia is not ready to come back to the negotiating table. I'm wondering, could a man and a plan named Kellogg, could it change that?
Well, I think that's the major question that we're all waiting to see. I think what's clear is that, Biden's approach hasn't been that successful. He said that his administration would support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and yet he's been unwilling to send Ukraine the weapons and air defenses that it needs to protect itself and to potentially gain territory back. So everyone is wondering, will Trump and his team, specifically Kellogg, the new special envoy to Ukraine, be the answer to this? And I think the real question is, what are they going to come to the table with? What do they expect Ukraine to come to the table with? And even bigger, what is Russia going to be willing to negotiate at the table as well? So a lot of moving parts and big questions here.
Yeah, let's talk about what would be possibly acceptable to Ukraine. Let's pull up, if we could, the terms of this Kellogg plan, the ones that we do know. I mean, it says, for example, delaying NATO membership, security guarantees, Russia controlling the territory that it occupies already, Ukraine renouncing force to take back territory. I mean, is any of this, in your opinion, acceptable and palatable to Kyiv?
So I do think that the big question that is on everyone's mind is, where is NATO membership going to fall in these potential ceasefire discussions? Because, according to Kyiv, according to Zelensky, and probably many others, they would say that no NATO membership is basically just delaying another invasion. So the answer to making sure that the rest of Ukraine remains a sovereign nation is to make sure that it is protected under NATO's Article 5 agreement. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, this is a total red line to Putin and Russia. They've said that delaying NATO membership isn't enough, even if it's delaying it by 15 or 20 years. So I think this is really the rub for both sides. It's not just about territory being ceded or recognized or not recognized. I think the security guarantees, the long-term security guarantees for Ukraine, and if they don't include NATO, that's really the big question here.
And I'm wondering, too, with Donald Trump, just weeks away from returning to the White House, what has that changed in terms of power, potential power for Ukrainian President Zelensky?
So I think what's important here is to note that Ukraine is not fighting from a position of control at the moment. They're not fighting from a position of strength. Russia is gaining more ground now than it has been at any time since the beginning of the war. And so Zelensky is in a really tough spot. Trump has said over and over again that he would end this war in 24 hours. Now, I think it's clear that this is not possible, but I also don't think that Trump wants to come in and allow Putin to dictate the rules of these potential negotiations. And so I think this puts Zelensky in a pretty tough position. Is it to give up NATO membership? Is it to cede territory? What is going to be the answer here, both for Putin and for Trump? Is he going to be part of these conversations? I think that's really important. Sure. Yeah. So a lot of stuff here.
That's a very important point to make. And you talk about, a point or position of power. How important is Europe in this equation?
I think Europe is a key part of this equation. Now, many countries in Europe, France, Germany, Poland, the Baltics, they have all really stepped up to the plate over the last few years. Now, Trump, of course, wants more from Europe. And so I think that we should expect some pressure to be placed on Europeans by Trump and his team. Another important thing here is, how do you even maintain a ceasefire line? Is it practical to expect the Europeans to do this all themselves, or will this line be taken seriously should a discussion like this come to pass if the United States of America is not part of a peacekeeping force or a ceasefire force? And so I think Europe is going to be a major part of this. There will likely be discussions about potential European troops on the ground. We'll have to see how this develops. But I think a major question here is, what does Trump expect, and will the United States be a part of it?
Rachel Rizzo with the Atlantic Council joining us from Washington. Rachel, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you.
Thanks.
And for more now, I want to pull in Jonathan Katz. He's Senior Director of the Anti-Corruption, Democracy and Security Project at the Brookings Institution. Jonathan, it's good to have you back on the program. Happy New Year to you. What do you make of this Kellogg plan for Ukraine?
I think we're all, sort of hoping that we would see some sort of peace in Ukraine, but those that have worked on this issue for many years understand that is going to be an incredibly difficult road for negotiations with Russia. So while the Trump administration coming in may have a plan for day one to, as President Trump has said, to solve this issue, to make peace, to have some sort of a ceasefire, the reality is much different when you look at what's happening on the ground and how Ukrainians feel about the peace that they want, how Europe views peace, including neighbors on the border with Ukraine, and how the United States views it.
Russia has welcomed the Kellogg plan, calling it a good starting point. Should Ukraine be worried by that? The Kremlin has not accepted any starting points on negotiations since its invasion began almost 3 years ago.
I think you're getting a mixed message from Moscow on this. If you heard Mr. Lavrov the other day, who's their foreign minister, he's basically said that that they reject many of the Trump demands. So, today they might be willing to say we're willing to sit down and listen. But when push comes to shove, Mr. Putin believes right now that he has the upper hand, both in terms of what's happening in terms of territory gained in Ukraine right now, but also what they perceive to be a friendly administration in Washington that's more likely to take Russia's point of view.
There's been a lot of talk about Ukraine shifting its red lines as a result of the Kellogg plan. And I'm wondering, what about Russia? Are there any red lines that Vladimir Putin would be willing to move?
I'm of the school, and I think many others are, that Mr. Putin is seeking maximalist gains. What he wants is really a Ukraine that will never be part of NATO or the EU. What he wants is recognition of the territories that he's illegally taken. What he wants is an end to U.S. sanctions. And so I don't think anyone who is taking this seriously thinks that Putin is going to settle for anything less than these maximalist gains. And if you think otherwise, then we're deluding ourselves. There has not been an international agreement that Putin has agreed to that he has kept. So I think we're all kidding ourselves if we think he's ready to sit down at the table and accept anything except for his maximalist demands.
And we know that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are two leaders with sizable, healthy egos. With that in mind, if Trump ensures that Russia negotiates directly with the United States and not with Ukraine, do you think that will increase the possibility of Putin bending to some demands being made by Kyiv?
No, the United States has little leverage over Putin to minimize what his demands might be. And I think it would be an absolute mistake to think that you can negotiate without having the Ukrainians at the table, or to have the Europeans at the table, given that they also have a tremendous amount at stake, including those countries that both border Ukraine and former Soviet countries that are now EU and NATO member states. They're all concerned as well. So I don't think it's realistic to see a direct negotiation between the United States and Russia solve this. I think this is going to require Ukraine, the European Union, European countries, and the U.S. together sort of figuring this out going forward.
I was speaking with an analyst earlier this evening, and he said that Vladimir Putin has made it clear that he will not negotiate with Ukraine, no direct negotiations with this. So if that's the case, then, are these negotiations, is this Kellogg plan, is it a non-starter?
It's not that it's a non-starter, and there's also past history of Russians sitting down with the Ukrainians to negotiate. Now, that hasn't led to success, but there were moments even in the middle of this conflict, including in the Black Sea over the grain deal, where there were things that were able to get done. So it may be that Putin is saying this, but there's past history that shows that they can sit down. I'm just not sure at this point that that's going to achieve the objectives that either side has, including Ukraine, which requires security. It has to have a country that is rebuilt. So the Kellogg plan doesn't really lay out how security is going to be provided for Ukraine or how Ukraine is going to be rebuilt, which will cost billions as well. So there's a lot of details to be worked out. And I think at the minimum, or maybe maximum, you might see a ceasefire, but it's unlikely to lead to a lasting and stable agreement that ensures peace and security for the Ukrainians in this case.
You know, Donald Trump, he campaigned for a second term in the White House on the promise that he would end the war in Ukraine. He said in just 24 hours. In fact, he even said that he would end the war on his first day back in the White House. Now, the closer we get to Inauguration Day, that 24-hour end to the war, it's looking less likely, isn't it?
It's very unlikely that you'll see anything within the first 24 hours. There's a lot of things that the Trump administration has said that it will prioritize on day one. And let's recall, a lot of people say that Trump will do this because it's a promise. He is now a one-term president. So I don't think that Trump is going to be campaigning again for another presidency. And I think diplomacy is extraordinarily difficult. This has been a conflict for almost 3 years, with countless lives lost, including on the Ukrainian side, children that have been kidnapped. This is a very difficult and challenging negotiation. And President Trump, President-elect Trump, has never negotiated anything like this before in his first administration. He's now a wartime president, and this will be a challenge for him and his administration.
And what about U.S. commitment to Ukraine in the post-war reality that one day we assume will come? I mean, Trump will be in power for 4 years, and then that's it. Ukraine's time horizon is much longer. I mean, what can Kyiv expect from Washington? What can it expect maybe from NATO looking into the distant future?
That's a billion-dollar question right now, and it largely depends on what happens over these next couple of weeks. What will a negotiation look like if it does happen? And what are the terms post that agreement? And so Ukraine is going to have to continue to rely heavily on partners to support its economic needs, its humanitarian needs, but also its military needs. And that's going to be a fact for the near to longer future. And so it's so important that the United States be there as part of that coalition. But Europe can also pick up a heavy amount of that slack. EU member states, let's not forget, Ukraine is on a track to become an EU member state when it fulfills the criteria that the EU has established. So I think all these are going to factor in, but I know that's something that Trump is focused on, which is the balance of funding and support for Ukraine. And I think we'll just have to see how these next few weeks go and what the negotiations look like. There's still strong bipartisan support for Ukraine in the United States, in Congress. We'll see how that factors into the support and the level of support over the immediate term in the Trump presidency and what happens beyond.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to be watching because Inauguration Day is not far away. Jonathan Katz joining us tonight. Jonathan, as always, we appreciate your time and your analysis. Thank you.